So I'm Emma Gilmour, and I'm going to talk about 7 things that I learned when starting an accessibility community. Just a little bit of background on me first and how I sort of got into accessibility. I've been a front-end developer for just about 4 years or so. And the first company that I started with had a major accessibility project that they needed to be done. And I was extremely junior and really shouldn't have been the person leading on that, but it kind of, as happens with accessibility sometimes, went through a lot of other developers and fell into my lap. So that's really how I kind of learned a lot about accessibility. And then whenever I moved to AO, I co-founded the Accessibility Guild with a couple of other developers and testers. And we spent about 1.5 years kind of building that up and really trying to implement accessibility across all teams and encourage best practice and really bringing that on board in different projects. When I left AO, then I went to xDesign. That's where I currently am. And even before I joined xDesign, I actually did a talk for the Global Accessibility Awareness Day with xDesign, which was really, really good. And that was kind of one of the major things for me joining xDesign, was the fact that they were so proactive about accessibility. And Paul, who is a tester at xDesign, was talking about starting an accessibility council. So right from the moment I joined, I was involved with the accessibility council there. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I learned across all of those different experiences, mainly from AO and xDesign, but even a little bit from the first company that I was with. So it's much easier to get started with a few people than trying to get it off the ground by yourself. It can be done, but just having a couple of more people to sort of share the load, to organize things, to give an idea of what is the best way to approach things, particularly if these are people who have been at a company longer than you. They might know the best people to get involved. And that's certainly what I found at AO, was that the QA who joined me in this, he had been at the company for a few years. He knew everybody who kind of had all of that really good accessibility knowledge, who would be keen to get involved, even what had been tried before, because nearly always there is somebody who has actually tried to get something off the ground before at a company, or who has brought knowledge from somewhere else. And rather than sort of retreading old ground, it's great to get those conversations going really early on. And moving on into then just about involvement across all roles. As I say, it was a QA and a developer. So it wasn't just me as a developer or me with other developers. It's really important to get that involvement from across loads of different roles. So QA and development were the first that we got involved. Then we started to get UX on board, and they were really keen, because obviously if you're going to think about accessibility, you want to think about that at the beginning of that journey with your designs, because I've certainly seen many occasions when a design would have come to me and I'll have to send it back and say, well, this isn't going to meet the accessibility criteria that we're trying to hit. But even outside of that, we got BAs involved, so that we could get that work prioritized in. We would get even recruitment get involved to try and improve the recruitment process to make it more accessible. That's certainly a big priority at xDesign, making sure that it's an inclusive process. So it's really important to have all of those conversations and to get all of those different kinds of people involved, and even just getting different viewpoints, because it's quite easy with accessibility as a developer to just get really into the code and to think about it from that level. And somebody from UX will come in and say, okay, well, here's a really interesting design. How can we make that accessible? And it has actually made me more creative as a developer. Getting good levels of engagement takes trial and error. So particularly at AO, when I started, we initially were having well, at the time it had just sort of come to lockdown, so we were all online. But we were trying to get people to come to meetings, I think it was every other week, to join a meeting and get ideas going and start different conversations. And it was really, really well attended at first. And then as other different guilds started up, a lot of people found that their calendars were getting more and more filled up, and it was more difficult to try and get those same numbers. So we moved more to sort of asynchronous communication and to get people involved in, it was Microsoft Teams channel that we had. And we had a lot of really good involvement there. It worked really well for that particular format. But in contrast, at xDesign, we're still seeing really good levels of engagement. People are just, the type of work that we do is much different to AO. So you'll always kind of have a few people who'll be able to find time to come along to a meeting. So it won't necessarily always be the same people, but it's just a different kind of environment. So actually, we're not having to focus as much on those asynchronous methods. We can have those regular meetings, and that works really well. But it's just a case of trying things out. It's quite easy to get disheartened and to think, okay, people aren't coming to the meetings anymore, they're not interested. When in actual fact, it's just a case of there's too many other meetings that are clashing at the same time, and even moving them around is not going to work. So it really does depend on what people prefer and how to kind of make it easiest for people to get involved. Most of the resistance to accessibility is down to a lack of knowledge. And I've found that to be pretty universal across anywhere that I have worked or anybody that I've spoken to. It's a case of people not actually knowing how many people it affects. So I think quite a lot when I talk to people, they think about somebody who maybe has sight difficulties or is blind and relies on a screen reader, and that's kind of the predominant idea. Not so many people think about the different kinds of accessibility, so that it might be situational or temporary. Somebody might have a sprained wrist and can only use their mobile with one hand. Is your sight accessible even to somebody like that? Or somebody is holding a baby and same thing. There's different kinds of accessibility needs, and they're extremely wide ranging. So I think a lot of people don't think about the different ways that it can affect lots of different people's lives. They also don't necessarily know how much of an impact it can make. So while I don't particularly like to think about the financial aspect of it, there is a lot of money that is being lost, for example, in e-commerce, because you can't navigate a checkout on a website with a screen reader. So people are just dropping off on that journey, and they're not actually converting then to become customers. People who have accessibility needs, if they find something that works, they will keep going back to it and they will keep using it. So if your site isn't actually accessible, particularly a lot of sites aren't accessible right from the homepage, you've already lost that customer. And that can be a lot more wide-ranging than people think, particularly like major shareholders within a company, who are in charge of making those decisions about, do we prioritize accessibility? A lot of times they will maybe make that decision based on the fact that they think it's only a handful of people who are actually affected. So it's not necessarily the best thing. I prefer the person-led approach, but at the same time, if it's going to get your shareholders on board, and they're going to say, yes, let's prioritize accessibility, then sometimes it's a good way to get that conversation started at least. So another thing that any kind of accessibility community is really good for is facilitating self-advocacy. So ideally, you don't want to be talking for people with disabilities. You want to make it easier to actually allow people to self-advocate. And that's one of the great things about having a recruitment process that's inclusive. you get more people into the company who can actually say, this doesn't work. I know this from experience, and prevent things kind of getting really far down the pipeline of development to the point where, you know, you get to user testing, if you do actually even use user testing, and find that there's a major problem, say, with the design, and it's got to go back through that whole process again. If you have people involved at all levels of the development process, then it's going to be flagged a lot earlier, and you're going to have a much more diverse viewpoint, which is always really good for any company anyway. So another great thing that particularly I've discovered, you know, a couple of times, but more recently, so last week as well, is solving real world problems makes it more sustainable. So it's, you know, you can start an accessibility community like to advocate and to have all of that knowledge, but actually, like anything, if you're not having real world problems to apply it to, it makes it that little bit more difficult to keep people's interest and for people to think about what the actual value is. So for example, last week, somebody was looking for resources to build an onboarding package for new developers or UX or testers, just anybody who is starting with the company, so that they can learn things maybe in their interim period between finishing their last role and joining us. And rather than continue on with the roadmap that we have for the Accessibility Council, we actually spent the session discussing this and, you know, solving this problem, finding these different resources, because an accessibility community is a fantastic resource. And if you're using it to actually solve the problems that you have day to day, then it's really powerful. It can really, you know, make an impact. And what this person was saying was that they had a lot of people who were actually coming to them at interview and saying, do you do anything with accessibility? Is this something that that is a priority? And that's happening more and more. So for us to already have an accessibility council in place means that we can build up those resources for people who are interested but don't necessarily have the knowledge yet, or we already have a community that they can get involved in and, you know, hit the ground running with it. And then the final point is that it's a journey without an end. You really do have to enjoy the wins that you get day to day, because it's always changing. There's always different ways that you can do things and different discussions about what is the best approach. There's not really an end. You know, you're very fortunate if you have a site or a product that you can make accessible and you're done. That's not been my experience anywhere. So I think it's quite easy to get disheartened and think this is never ending. This is always going to be something that we're going to have to work on. But to me, that's one of the real benefits, because you can always make something better. But you just have to make sure to focus on those little things that you can celebrate along the way, so that you don't get caught up in the, okay, we've still got miles to go and it's never going to end. So yeah, it's all about just enjoying the process. And that's it. Thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Emma. It was a very, very interesting talk. So we did have a couple of questions kind of come through here. One of the last ones was like, you mentioned the term accessibility council. Like, say perchance you're in a company and they don't have this kind of thing, like, you know, what would be like your kind of guidance to, like, you know, setting this up and getting that buy-in and leadership acknowledgement?
Yeah, that's kind of the toughest thing. So I mean, none of this is necessarily both the Accessibility Council at xDesign and the Guild at AO, neither of them necessarily have kind of oversight from people higher up. It's a case of we started it, ourselves. Certainly there was people higher up who definitely believe in it. I'm not saying that that's not the case, but you can do this kind of thing even if you don't have that buy-in yet. I would say that it's a good avenue to get that buy-in. Certainly I've experienced that we got more as we went on, the more that we kind of made little impacts here and there, because there's always something small that you can add to a project, or even just a conversation that you have that you weren't expecting to have. It can make more of an impact than you realize.
I guess actually that even tackle, I have a question myself on that. Like I'm in an accessibility committee in work, and whenever I mention anyone outside of that committee, the first kind of jump to thought is like, right, what level of accessibility we're trying to do here? People jump to they get afraid of right, what do we have to support? Like in your experience, or in your committee at the minute, what is your level, and how do you just handle that kind of scaredness?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting because there were similarities between the two different companies that I've done this at, and you had separate projects, and in xDesign's case you have separate clients. It's arguably more difficult when you have clients because they're paying for it. So if they say we don't want it, it's very hard to kind of make the case for it, in a sense. What we're working on right now is to have a minimal level. We're still working on that, working out what that should be. We're aiming for level AA of the WCAG criteria. That's as a minimum, we're aiming for that, because really anything below that it is worth doing, but it's not going to make that kind of an impact. It's a tricky one though, because you do want to kind of present the case and say, here's why you should aim for that. But it can be an uphill battle.
No, for sure, because I'm also part of the accessibility committee and work as well. And I think part of the challenge that we've had is that getting that buy-in. It is getting that, there is this kind of fear aspect, as Chris mentioned, where it's like, do we have to do this? Do we have to do this? But it's more of a case of we should do this so that people can use our products, please. But and because of that kind of attitude, one of my questions is, how do you kind of prioritize accessibility when there's deadlines and legacy code that will take time to be rewritten, and but you're trying to implement new features, so therefore should be accessible? And it's kind of how do you make those decisions?
Yeah, so I think a big thing is to look for the quick wins, and to accept the fact that it's not a case of even having to make everything accessible. It's about taking ownership and responsibility for the things that you can't. So I think so long as you're upfront and say, this isn't necessarily accessible right now, there's a reason for that, try to provide an alternative for it. But also any new code that you write, just from a specific developer point of view, write it accessibly. So if it's new, then write it right from the off, because that's just then going to become part of the regular code writing cycle. It's, if you're adhering to good standards anyway, then really that should be just naturally kind of a part of it. We all know, there's always that thing that you just think, oh, I'll come back to it. You're never going to come back to it. I know this. Everything that I have worked on has been legacy apart from one project. And even that one project, I know that there's bits in it that they wouldn't have met the criteria. And I did think at the time, I will come back to that. And I just didn't get to come back to it. It doesn't have to be all or nothing as well. So this is another conversation that we're having at the minute, where it's very easy to just look at that criteria checklist and say, we have to hit all of these. And I have been handed in a previous role that checklist on a spreadsheet and told I have to hit all of these. Now, what was really interesting and a lot of fun was the one about video content, when there was absolutely no video content on the site. So that wasn't going to be one I could achieve.
Yeah, I think that's kind of our initiative too, is we're kind of taking it pieces at a time. Right now it's navigation, etc. So it's like, how can we improve that versus everything, everything at once. But thank you so much. Like, it's great.
Yeah, so we got a question there as well. Is the WCAG, I'm assuming that's an accessibility term that I probably haven't learned yet, documentation the only place devs can go for guidance?
No, I would actually, I mean, that is a very, very dry document. It is the hardest thing. I would actually search for like a WCAG checklist or something, like something that parses it into more natural speak. So there's a few different things. I can't remember off the top of my head what the actual checklist is, but it's one that puts it in much more readable terms. So you can just search anything like readable WCAG or easy version of WCAG, something that will actually just say, okay, give me the document, but please don't give it to me in its normal form, because it is, I have read it in full from beginning to end, and it is painful to get through. Ironically, it's incredibly inaccessible. But I think as well, some of the really good places to start are blogs from some of the kind of major people. So people like Marcy Sutton. There used to be also, I can't remember, I think it was Lindsay Kopaz, but I don't think she's actually active online anymore, but I think her blog is still active. Leonie Watson, I think, is another one. So there's a few really, really good people. Kind of, if you get to Marcy Sutton, you'll generally find quite a few people from her. She's on Twitter, and she'd be sort of one of the biggest names, and certainly who I would have sort of mined a lot of information from her blog.
It's interesting. We got Dermot shared a link into the Axe Chrome DevTools plugin.
Yeah.
I've seen a few different plugins and different tools. Is there like, is there like the kind of like the tool belt of like, what you should have when you're testing accessibility, like, the go-to Chrome plugin, the go-to like screen reader, those kind of things that you would maybe recommend to people?
I would love to say that there's one. There is not. I don't think there ever will be. Automated testing, at the last count, I think it had managed to reach something like 50% coverage, but only if you combined maybe 3 different tools. So tools like Wave, Axe, and to a lesser extent Lighthouse. I think Lighthouse, for me, when I've looked at more recently, they're more focused on performance now. But it's interesting to see the things that one will catch that the other one won't. The other thing is, if you're using, which obviously a lot of people might be using the JavaScript in their code bases, you can install JS in there, so you can get some degree of automated testing. All of those are built, as far as I know, on the Axe plugin. So you can get Cypress Axe or Jest Axe, and you can put them in. Again, they actually both capture slightly different things, even though they're the same tool. So yeah, things like that. Anything that, so there's a tool called Colorblindly, which lets you see what a site looks like in different kinds of color blindness. There is a fantastic tool that I haven't used myself, but I know Paul at xDesign works with Funkify, which simulates a lot of different kinds of visual disabilities. The thing with that I have found, and certainly working on an accessibility project right now, is that manual testing is still going to be a massive part of everything. So I'm reasonably proficient with NVDA and JAWS, but VoiceOver is something that I'm using right now. And even though it is a screen reader, it feels a world apart for me. I would say none of it is really going to replace somebody who is a day-to-day screen reader user, really user testing, having people involved who actually have this knowledge of these accessibility tools from day-to-day life. That's the thing that really most projects need.
Yeah, I find that such like a poignant kind of side of it, where annoyingly you need the user to be able to verify like what you're doing. Like we have, well, I'm speaking for myself and not everyone here, but like I have the luxury of like, I can try this tool, but I will never experience it in that same kind of way. And it's like, it's trying to like, I remember I came on the term before in work and everyone gave me grief about it. It was like, walking a mile in the user's shoes, but it's such a hard thing to do and such a hard thing to achieve.
Yeah, definitely.
I have one little question. Was actually a question I kind of picked up you were talking through, and it's somewhat related to accessibility anyway, but you mentioned about like how you change like the communication when you're working with people on accessibility from like asynchronous to asynchronous. I was just kind of curious as like it's almost kind of leading into like some of the other topics that we had today, like what was like the driving force and the benefits, and like like how did that help kind of, even if it does feed in accessibility, like how did that kind of feed into that?
So just the different communication methods, sorry.
Yeah, like because like even like I'll say like Louise and myself have been talking about like we're like in an accessibility community or like council in our own place of work, and I'm curious to see like how they go and move into asynchronous communications, like how's that like kind of benefited that council and like help that kind of community grow.
Yeah, so it's funny because we had a term at AO called guild fatigue, and basically about 6 different guilds sprang up overnight, and ours was one of them. So everybody saw great attendance initially, and then everybody just got tired of being involved in different guilds. So it just made it so easy. People would kind of, I mean, I did a lot of work posting quite regularly in that group initially, and again, it was just that handful of us that started that process. So it can feel a little bit like shouting into the void because there's only the same people posting over and over. But the difference is when people see that there is stuff happening in that channel more regularly, then they start to maybe just like the post or react to it or whatever. Then they start commenting on it. Then people start posting their own thing. And it's a very gradual process. But you kind of have to keep the faith that it is gonna work, it is gonna happen. It's very easy to just say, this is just me, I'm just posting articles all the time and I'm the only one reading them. But yeah, I've at least been fortunate that it has gotten better. But yeah, in stark contrast then xDesign, we have much more discussions than we post a lot of the time. So we're working on that right now. How do we get that engagement up in the Slack group? Whereas we have no problems with that with meetings.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's really awesome to hear. Like, in different companies and different places, like it happens differently. And like we've like, small tents on the meetings, but high engagement on the Slack channel. And even the point, like you were talking about, like sharing some posts and stuff. Like I saw HMRC had put out a blog post recently about how they had made like how they switched like full accessible. I was like, I might just drop the article. I was like, no, I need to read the article first before I drop it. So when someone says like, yeah, that was really interesting, that the fact that they didn't do it right, I'm like, okay, at least I would know that the case was. But no, okay, that's awesome. That's really good. Again, thank you so much. An amazing talk.